Hey, it's Drybear. Another week has come and went, so it's time to check in on our tank rankings in Season 1 of Dragonflight Week 10. If you found value in this video, leave a like down below. It helps me out tremendously. Subscribe for more gaming content. And as always, if you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and say hi. And we'll start the way we always do, which is checking in on last week's numbers. So what you're seeing on screen is the performance of tanks at the end of week 9. We are now at the end of week 10. Technically, we are currently in the start of week 11, but I pulled the numbers at the end of week 10 before the reset happened. So this is from the end of week 9 where the tanks were. We had some concerns about Guardian and its performance, some concerns about the passive tankiness of Vengeance, though when they are well supported, they do just fine. We've seen that Protection Paladins have been on the rise, specifically in Mythic Plus. Ever since like since the holiday, actually, they've been doing quite well. And Protection Warrior had started to slip a little bit. They did receive a nerf, and that seemed to have an impact on them. And I think either people are getting bored and playing other classes, or Protection Warrior is just falling down a little bit. So this is week 9. Let's see how this changes going into week 10. And here we are with the end of week 10 statistics. A bit of a disclaimer, this is pulled from Warcraft logs. Ranking tanks is a challenging thing to do because you just need them to not die. You can look at things like damage output, but that will vary. You could look at self-healing, but some tanks focus more on mitigation than they do self-healing. Some do absorption, some do self-healing. There's always going to be different metrics. So this is looking at Mythic Plus. It is the points. And then for Raid, it's looking at completion and speed. So effectiveness at the highest percentile, which tanks are performing the best. And I think that's just generally, there's no perfect metrics for it when it comes to tanks, but that's the way I look at it as far as how you rank them. So let's look at where this is right now. I think the first thing to talk about is that Blood DK has taken the top spot, partially because they were able to bring up their Mythic Plus score. So they were doing a little bit lower in Mythic Plus for a while. And I guess the issue was, Blizzard put a buff patch out that increased all the damage that Blood DK dealt. And I guess they were accurate in saying that that was the issue, especially when it comes to higher keys where you need your tank and your healer to be doing regular damage. Blood DK, I guess, just wasn't doing enough damage compared to others, not popping Avatar and Ravager and ruining the whole area and destroying every mob in sight. So I guess they needed a little bit of a bump there, and it actually was extremely effective for them. So Blood DK takes the first place overall this week for tanks. They have an amazing heroic raid score. I think a lot of this too is that they can be left on their own. They have a lot of self-healing. They're very easily self-managed, and a lot of times they can just ignore that they even have healers because they can take care of themselves. And then their score coming up in Mythic Plus helped out quite a bit. I think one of the things that we want to look at here is there was a discrepancy at the beginning of the season where Protection Warrior and Blood DK were ahead of the pack by a noticeable margin, and then like Guardian Druid and Protection Paladin were behind the pack by a noticeable margin. And I think over all the changes they've had over the last 2 months, they have been able to kind of smooth that curve out. It does look like Guardian still needs a little bit of love, and they are getting some in 10.0.7. But overall, I think the tanks are actually in a pretty good spot. I think some of the weak spots that Guardian had were covered up with some of the previous patches and some of the updates they got in 10.0.5, which is nice. I think they still struggle in Mythic Plus, but as you can see, if you look at the scores for Mythic Plus down there in the bottom left, everyone except for Guardian is about the same. It's kind of shocking to see how well they've been able to bring the tanks together in 5-man settings. And Guardian, I think, either just needs more healing or maybe more damage. They're just not keeping up with the other tanks when it comes to AoE pulls and when it comes to doing Mythic Plus at a high speed. So maybe a little bit more for them there. But I think these scores are remarkably close. I mean, they're really good. I think tanks are in a great spot right now. We'll see what happens with Protection Paladin going into 10.0.7. They're getting a whole bunch of changes to their class tree, their spec tree, and just the class in general. Paladin's getting a lot of attention for 10.0.7. So we'll see how that affects them. I think right now they're pretty good. This is actually probably one of Protection Paladin's weaker weeks. They historically They were lower on the lower side for raid, and then they were climbing pretty drastically at the end of January in Mythic Plus, and they've been kind of holding on to that. They were actually in the first or second slot for a couple weeks in Mythic Plus, where they just, they dominate. I think some of the dungeons they have now in Season 1 benefit them, but they're also just, if you can manage, this is kind of like the situation with Paladin in general. They're very cooldown dependent, which means that if you can manage your cooldown windows properly so that you always have them up when they're needed most, Paladin, all 3 specs do amazing. Even Retribution has been demonstrated to show very, very good numbers. Holy Paladin, Protection Paladin. The problem with Paladin right now is that if you mismanage your cooldowns and you don't have your long, 2-3 minute cooldowns when you need them, things go wrong. They really rely on those important windows to do their best. So, I think you kind of see that in the numbers for all 3 specializations of Paladin. But this week, I think the only standouts for me would be Guardian Druid in Mythic Plus doing the lowest, and then Protection Paladin and Guardian Druid in Raid would be standout. But for the rest of it, all looks pretty easy. Second place overall is Brewmaster, primarily because of their Raid performance. They were the #1 tank performer in Mythic Raid this week. And in Heroic Raid, they were second, closely tied, like just behind Blood DK. And I'm shocked to see them on the lower end on Mythic Plus, but again, those numbers are so close. They're within stone throwing distance of each other where they can really get it. And I think one of the challenges with Brewmaster, especially when it comes to varied amounts of content, is Brewmaster does best when the difficulty is at its highest. If they don't regularly reach Red Stagger and they're not able to build up 10 stack brews, then they actually, I think, underperform the other tanks. But if they can, if they're getting enough, if they're taking enough damage that they can manage their stagger and use their cooldowns properly, they're one of the best tanks in the game. They're insanely good. They still have great damage even after the damage rework of 10.0.5. So they're in an amazing spot. And they just suffer a little bit from global cooldown bloat, where they just have a lot of buttons to press and not a lot of time to do them. And they all do something important. And so you really have to kind of, every time you have to cleanse or expel harm, it hurts you because you just, you want to be using your globals for something else. But I think they're in an amazing spot. So Brewmasters rejoice. Protection Warrior, for possibly the first time this season, I'd have to go back and look, but they are not in the top 2. In fact, most of the season they were in the first slot. They did get nerfed a little bit, and they've been in the top 3 ever since. But this time they're in the 3rd spot. They are exactly 3rd in Mythic Raid and Heroic Raid. And then for Mythic Plus, they are still the highest. I don't know what can change right now to make Protection Warrior not the best in Mythic Plus. Not only do they have incredible AoE burst potential, like I said earlier, you can pop all your cooldowns, throw down your Ravager, and you can just start, cleaving and stomping. And the damage output they have is actually ridiculous. In a burst big pull, they can do nonsense damage. And there's some fights where, a boss does a single target casted spell. They can spell reflect that, and it can hit from anywhere from 100k to 300k damage in a single strike. So not only are they getting physical damage, but they're reflecting magical damage. They are so good in Mythic Plus for that reason, and they have a ton of tools. They have Rallying Cry. They have tons of different ways to build mitigation, damage reduction, absorption with Ignore Pain. They're so good. Like, they're just insanely good. So for Mythic Plus, they're doing it. And then in Raid, Heroic Raid and Mythic Raid, they were in the top 3. They were 3rd place. You can see actually it's the same 3 tanks in Raid. So Blood, Brewmaster, and Protection Warrior, the 3 best tanks in Raid this week. In the 4th slot is Vengeance Demon Hunter. They are pretty close to tied to Protection Warrior in Raid overall. They're performing about the same. This is kind of cool to see. I mean, they got a slight tankiness update in 2 different patches that I think benefited them in a nice way, and it seems to have been holding. I think there probably still needs to be a little bit of a passive tankiness upgrade, but maybe not. I mean, these numbers are actually looking pretty good, pretty healthy for them in general. The 5th slot here goes to Protection Paladin, and they are doing quite well in Mythic Plus, just as good as any other tank except Guardian. And they're doing, this has actually probably been their worst week for raid. Historically, they've been doing just fine in raid, but in heroic raid, we're actually seeing that Protection Paladin Guardian a little bit of a standout, and mostly for that. In fact, if Protection Paladin was slightly better in raid, they would probably be just caught up with everyone, and it would just be Guardian a little bit behind. But again, they're getting the most changes in 10.0.7, so maybe we just wait to see how that all plays out once those changes go live. Guardian Druid is in the last slot, and you can see why. I mean, they struggle a lot in heroic raid. They're still kind of at that bottom point. They do still struggle a little bit in mythic raid. They actually outperformed Protection Paladin this week in mythic raid. And then in mythic plus, they are a standard deviation away from the rest of the tanks. It's kind of shocking how poorly they're doing in mythic plus. So let me know what you think on why you think Guardian does so poorly. I haven't really pushed my Guardian Bear higher than 18s to 20s. I kind of just play it, just go, hey, I want to play Bear for a little bit. I do it, but I haven't really been doing any kind of like really insane cutting edge content with Guardian. And for me, it performs fine. You do have to manage all your cooldowns properly, but if you use Survival Instincts when you can, you have Bark Skin on the ready, and you're able to, there's a couple builds that have come out. You can try the Neo Regrowth build that came out of the last major update, or you can go with the normal Arcane Damage build. But in general, I think Guardian's fine. It just takes a little bit more gear, a little bit more practice, and there's less room for error. If you make error with Guardian, it seems like, it feels like they die a lot easier, whereas some of the other tanks can make error in their rotation and their timings and not die. And then in Mythic Plus, Guardian Druid just is a big standout. That's probably the number one thing to take away from this, is that Mythic Plus Guardian Druid needs some love. So maybe they'll get it. We'll see. But let me know what you think down below, what you hope to see in 10.0.7 and beyond. But that's the tank check-in for the week. Another rotation around the weekly life that we live. If you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and say hi. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.